Now, some more pictures from that era. This picture was taken in winter 1924. If it is the winter of 24-25, then I would be 3.5 years old, and that's probably about right. And here is another one, clearly taken at the same time, with my hobby horse. Well, there is nothing much I can add to this picture. Perhaps the only thing I can say is to take note of the tall, laced-up boots. Obviously a cavalryman. Here is one, perhaps a couple of years later, me and my convertible sports car.
That car would be your car, or would be a prop at the studio?
No, I think I had a car like that. This may be about the same time or slightly earlier. We used to have internal passports in Chinese and in Russian, as befits Harbin. I am dressed in the traditional uniform of a Russian schoolboy. And here I am with someone very dear to me, my nanny, this time not Paula, my nanny, and obviously taking, not necessarily in the middle of winter, but in typical winter garb. If you go to Russia now, you'll see all the little kids of that age running around the street, just like this, with a wool scarf wrapped several times around their necks and the long ends tied in the back and falling down like a horse's tail. And that's how I was.
And your nanny was Russian?
She was Russian,
Jewish?
yes. No, she wasn't Jewish. There were very few Jews who acted as nannies. This is something special. Here I'm considerably older. But for some dress-up party, my father had a Chinese mailman's uniform made for me. Somehow got hold of all the insignia of a Chinese mailman of Harbin at that time.
Would you have been in Iran then?
Could be. And indeed I have lots of Iran pictures to show too. This may be about the same time or slightly earlier. Here I must be, what, about 7? With banks. Otherwise known as cholka in Russian. Cholka. Well, what I've got there is a pair of pants, a new pair of pants, great pair of pants too, made by my mother, homemade, and I'm ready to go out. As you can see, I'm reaching for the door.
Made from men's pockets?
Yes. The best men's pockets in all of Siberia. Well, I think these pictures are self-explanatory. They're in that new apartment that we moved into, and Polly lived with us there. I think I had a separate room as far back as I know.
When we visited Harbin, you remember you took me to see this apartment, to the building, and it was a very Russian kind of building. There was an archway that you go in, and there's a courtyard in it. And so Greg was saying, and that was my room, and an old toothless Chinese fella came out of somewhere and grinning but wanting to know what we were doing there. And so Greg remembered a few Chinese words, and he said the equivalent of I, and then he pointed to that window, and then he made a sign of how high he was. And
how low he was.
Or how low he was, and that's why I'm quite sure that it's that window that we're looking at. Anyhow, the guy said, So we went away, and we came back down that street half an hour later, and he was telling the whole street. He was pointing to Greg, and he was going through all the motions so high and pointing, So I feel that we're now inside that window.
Oh, yes.
The story that Joan is relating took place in 1981, summer 1981, when for the first time after 1938 I revisited Harbin. These are Lisa and Yakov. This picture is one of my mother as a teenager, still in Russia. As you see, the album it's all in sequence.
Yeah.
This is a picture not of my father, but of my uncle Yakov, in a typical Russian winter coat called padyovka. It's not warm enough for a real Russian cold winter, but it's warm enough for most other seasons. Here what we see is Uncle Joseph and his family.
Where was this taken?
In Japan. See, they came to the United States around 1920 or so, and then they came to San Francisco. They lived in San Francisco for a while and couldn't really do too well. So Uncle Lova who was then maintaining a business in Japan, as I told before, brought them over in the hope that somehow they would find something to do there. Well, they didn't. They stayed maybe about a year and returned to San Francisco. But here they are. Now, this is Uncle Joseph's wife, Ida. You remember her from the big picture where Uncle Joseph was holding the baby. And here she's holding a baby. That baby is most likely Harry, who was born almost the same time as I, and who was named after the same grandfather, Hirsch, Harry, Gregory, and all that. And on the left, it might be Johnny.
It looks a lot like Johnny.
Yeah. And this is Nadia, and this girl is Lucy, who is now, and has been for some time, the big businesswoman, living in the most luxurious estate in Southern California. Lucy was born in 1918, so she is over 75 now. Here, Nadia, the oldest, and the two boys, and Lucy, and the baby is somewhere else, not to be seen yet. This is from the same time, also in Japan, Louis Seichmann, now in Bangkok, and Johnny. This is Eugene, Nadia's husband. In other words, the husband of the oldest of the Seichmann siblings. Nadia was married very early in life, and she married also a Russian Jew, but who had lived in the States, in New York, quite a long time. He spoke unaccented English, who was a graduate student in anthropology and kind of perpetual graduate student in anthropology. And when the Depression came, Uncle Lyova invited Eugene and Nadia to Harbin, hoping to give him work, but he was not particularly suited for office work. He was very interesting. He was much more informed about innumerable things than any of us were, because he just came from New York and so on and so forth. He had a movie camera. He shot movies, wind-up movies. He was really a man of the world from over there. And here he is with my mother and me and Misha.
How long did he stick around there?
Oh, they stayed about 2 years and then they went back. His original name was Golmstock, which he anglicized to Holmes.
Oh, that's a good anglicization.
He would publish some articles in his field, and those he would sign with the original name. But for business purposes, he used Holmes.
Oh, that's great.
Eugene Holmes.
Did they have offspring?
No, they never had offspring. He died around 1950, still a relatively young man. He was quite a bit older than Nadia, probably about 10 years older, but he was somewhere in his 50s. He died of a heart attack collapsing on a sidewalk in Manhattan, just suddenly. Nadia remarried, and then she started the business, which later on became Lucy's business, because Nadia unfortunately also died. This is Mary of Moscow, born in 1929.
No kidding.
This is also before we left Russia. This is in Crimea, where my father went to recuperate from his lung ailment. And these are my cousins in Buenos Aires, Gregorio and Julia. You saw her as a little girl in that family picture, Julia.
This was taken in Buenos Aires?
Right. And that's how we sort of remained for many years, always together. This is Solnichny Gorodok, Sun City, which
Where is it?
It was on an island in the middle of Sungari, which was the river by Harbin, and a very big river it was, no smaller than the Mississippi by Dubuque. And that island was mostly sand, beach, so this was a kind of a clubhouse and dressing room and so on.
Is that
for
still
the beach.
there? Was it there in 81?
I think it was.
Well,
yeah.
that's why I thought of something.
I think it was. This is Nadia in Harbin. She was a very handsome woman and a lovely person, one of the loveliest people I've known, very sweet. She died, I think, of a brain tumor.
It must have been
Early 70s.
71 or 72.
Early 70s. But she established the very successful business, and Lucy worked with her, and then Lucy took it over.
And the business is...
Well, she was importing mostly novelties from India, painted boxes from Kashmir, that kind of things, and some things from Latin America. And then Lucy I think was the first to start importing Russian lacquer boxes and became the biggest importer of Russian lacquer boxes in the world. I think certainly the only one in the United States.
Who's that?
This?
Mm-hmm.
That's Nadia. See, we're at the same spot where those pictures were taken. This was taken by Eugene.
Who's that?
It's me and my mother. And here is Eugene. This picture was probably taken by Nadia. And if you look at that fence, you'll see it's the same place.
Yeah.
This is, of course, Uncle Leo in his office in Harbin. Up above are glass jars with samples of sugar. Now, at that time, he was probably still in his late 40s. He turned 50 in 36, but something tells me it was a little before 36. This picture is worth looking at. This, I think, is Nadia. This, I think, is Polya here, but I'm not sure.
Oh, I think Polya is the second one from the
Right.
right. Sure.
And this is my mother. And this is me. This is Misha.
Okay.
This is Clara, and this is Lucia.
And who's the old man with the
The old
specs?
man, his name was Schulman. He was quite an old man in his 80s. And this person, this woman here, next to my mother, is his wife. She was something, I think somewhere in her 40s that married this man.
And isn't Anna in between?
And Akolyova is in between, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we have Nadia, Polya, Lyova, Schulman's wife, and then your mother? That's your mother?
Yeah, this is my mother.
Oh, okay.
I don't know who the girl was.
Okay.
And this is somebody's ama, maybe Clara's ama for Lucia. This was taken in Hoshigara. Hoshigara was the seaside resort outside of Dairen, where we used to go from about 1927 to about 1930 every year. And then we started going to different resorts.
Now, I don't see your father or Grisha.
They were in the office working.
They were working where they
They
should
were in
be.
the office working, where they should be, of course. This man, I think, was a doctor. And I think he was Russian rather than Jewish.
What I like here is that the boss was playing. Lyova
Yeah.
was not working in the
that's
office.
right. That's right, yeah.
He was probably paying for that whole
For the
deal.
whole
Yeah,
thing.
that's right.
Yeah.
This probably was sent from Russia because this is Lisa, Elizabeth, my mother's elder sister. My impression is that this was sent to Harbin from either Stara Constantina or some other place in Ukraine. Lisa never had any children, but this may have been some relative and her son. She lived through the war. I told you before that her husband perished in the war. Then she returned to Stara Constantinov. She was in very dire straits because she could not prove to the Soviet authorities that she had been working or that she was a widow because her papers were destroyed in the war, burned or whatever. The Soviet Union being the Soviet Union, they just gave her 10 rubles a month, all of which she had to pay to privately rent a part of a room, not a room, what the Russians call renting a corner. I saw her in 1960 when I was just about 40 years old. In other words, 40 years or so after I had first seen her, first and last before that seen her. And as I mentioned, she had lost her husband in the war, and she had a lot of hard luck. She was living almost destitute. And indeed, insofar as she was able to subsist, it was through the remittances that were sent from here, from the United States, by Kolyova, by my mother. When I went to Russia in 1960, on my first return there after my departure in 1923, my mother informed somebody who was in touch with her that I would be coming and where I would be. And I'm not sure what means she used. If she used, of course, the regular mail, then the KGB would find out about it. She may have used not the regular mail, I'm not sure. But in any case, it was arranged that Lisa would take the train from Stara Constantinov to Kiev, where some relatives of hers would meet her, and at a certain preordained hour, late in the day, she would be brought to the hotel for foreigners where I would be staying, and that I would wait for her on the sidewalk before the hotel, and I would recognize her, of course. So sure enough, at the appointed hour, I saw 3 women approaching. One of them was obviously herself, another 2 were relatives of hers, not on our side of the family, but on her former husband's side of the family. So they brought her over. They were all, of course, quite tense, quite jittery, because they knew very well that I was watched by the KGB and that they might get into serious trouble and whatnot. Now, Lisa at that time was probably over 70. My mother was born in 1892, and Lisa was probably more than 2 years older than she, so she was about 70 in 1960. But what is more, she was already a little senile. She had been for some time. We knew that from her letters, that she was senile. She fortunately was renting her corner of her room from people who also took care of her and so on. So I took her into the hotel. What else could I do there? In Russia, there's no place to talk to people. And into my room, knowing full well that it was bugged. And so we talked all kinds of little things, how she was, and she asked my relatives were, and so on. It was all chit-chat. But of course, there's no such thing as innocent chit-chat in the Soviet Union. So we talked for a while. Before I took her away from her companions, they told me that they wouldn't be coming for her, but I could get a taxi. She knows where she has to go, and put her in the taxi, and the taxi will take her there. So by the time our conversation ended, I don't think we spent more than an hour. It was just not enough to talk about, especially with KGB listening in. So I took her outside and hailed the taxi, and then I asked, you know where you're going? I said, no, I don't know where I'm going. Where you're going to those people you came with? Oh, but I don't know where they live. Well, so I had this lady on my hands. What do I do with her? It would be bad enough in Stockholm or in Milan, but in the Soviet Union. Well, I remember that they mentioned something about the particular location of their apartment, and I tried to reconstruct it. I spoke to her. Does this mean anything to you? Does street name mean anything to you? Does that number mean anything to you? Well, she finally said, yes, it means something to me. Okay, it sounds familiar. But of course, I just couldn't put her in a taxi. What would I do with her? I put her in a taxi. She would be tossed out on the street, and what? So I went with her, knowing full well, again, that this is very risky. I had an American suit on me. It was not particularly conspicuous, but anybody looking close would immediately see I was a foreigner. That was a time when Russians still were not wearing suits that could be identified as foreign, and foreigners could be easily identified by the suits they wore. It was warm and so on, summer. So we went to that address by taxi, and I paid the taxi, and there we are. Well, it turns out to be one of those huge Russian apartment blocks, sort of a square city block or something like that, with perhaps about 20 entrances. And which entrance? You see? So I asked, well, do you remember the name of the people? And she had to sort of search her mind. Well, this is the name of the people. Well, fortunately, at the Russian entrances, there are usually lists of names and buttons to press and so on. So we must have, covered at least half a dozen entrances when we found somebody with that name. Couldn't be absolutely sure that this was the family. So we pressed the button, and we went up by one of these dinky Russian elevators, I don't know which floor, and we got out there, and somebody was already standing in the door, ready to open the door. We went up this dinky elevator and got off on a certain floor, and I think we actually pressed the button by the door, and the door was opened by a lady, and sure enough, it was one of those ladies who had brought her to me. So that was a relief, but that wasn't simple, because it also turned out, as I quickly realized, what the Russians call a communal apartment, meaning that there is a separate family in each room. So there may be 6 or 7. This was a very standard way, especially then, for people to live in, especially in big cities. And what happens in such cases that all the old crones open their doors into the hallway and look and see who came. So there was this woman, there was I in my American suit, and there was the little old lady that I brought, and about 5, 6 pairs of eyes looking at me. Okay, so obviously that other lady knew very well what to do. So immediately, without batting an eye, she said, "Oh, doctor, you didn't have to bring her yourself? We would have gotten her from the hospital. It's so nice for you to bring her, you know. And of course, I immediately realized what the story was. And fortunately, I can speak unaccented Russian and start saying, "Нет, нет, I don't mind at all. And actually, your aunt is in pretty good shape, but I did prescribe some medicine for her, and I want you to make sure that she takes that medicine regularly, just as prescribed."
Incredible.
And by that time, you see, we already walked into the one room that family occupied, and closed the door, and we all stood there. So I said, of course, very low, it wouldn't be very likely that room would be bugged, but anyways, I said in very low voice that she didn't know where to go, and I had to take her. I couldn't help it. And so we all sat down, and we sat silently for a few minutes, and then the husband of that woman turns to me and says, "Well, how do you live?" Meaning, how do you live back in America?
Yeah.
And without thinking, I said something I never forget. I said, "Well, you know how we live. Those who are doctors are doctors. Those who are not doctors are not doctors." I understand.
It's quite an answer.
They understood immediately. So we sat there for another 10 minutes, and then, of course, the comedy had to be repeated because I had to walk through down that hall. And again, doctor, it was so nice of you to bring her. And I said, "Oh, don't worry, she'll be better. Just make sure she takes this medicine." And then I bade goodbye to them, and also said something, if anything wrong, by bringing her over to me again, and so on. Goodbye. And then I stepped out on the stair landing, and I heaved a deep sigh.
That is incredible.
And then I walked back to the hotel because I noticed the road wasn't really very far, so I could walk.
So it would have been likely that these neighbors might report to somebody that foreigners were visiting.
Of course. Yeah. It was illegal at that time for anybody unauthorized speaking to a foreigner. Of course,
and especially old retired ladies like that would pick up a ruble or two from the KGB.
Yeah. Well, and besides, I might very well have been followed by the KGB.
You probably would.
And so they would come in and ask them, and so on. So.
Yeah.
But what was so interesting was how quickly, she went into that mode. She immediately went into that mode, and she figured out what to say and so on.